A millionaire comes home early, eager to surprise his daughter with an unexpected hug. But when he accidentally opens her lunchbox, he discovers something that shakes him to the core. What seemed like mere carelessness reveals a dark secret hidden within his own home. From that moment on, his and the girls' lives would never be the same again. The wheels of the Boeing 747 touched down on the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport 3 hours earlier than scheduled. Michael Sterling unbuckled his seatbelt and reached for his carry-on, his mind already racing ahead to the surprise he was about to deliver. After 2 weeks in Tokyo closing a multi-million-dollar merger, all he wanted was to see his family. He pictured little Emma's face lighting up when he walked through the door, her small arms wrapping around his neck. The thought made him smile as he flagged down a taxi outside the terminal. The Sterling residence in Lincoln Park stood pristine against the grey November sky. Michael paid the driver and wheeled his luggage up the stone pathway, noticing how immaculate the front garden looked. Victoria had clearly kept everything in perfect order during his absence. He felt a surge of gratitude toward his wife of 18 months. After losing Emma's mother, Sarah, 3 years ago to a sudden illness, he never thought he would find someone willing to take on the responsibility of raising another woman's child. Victoria had seemed like a blessing when they met at a charity gala. She was elegant, sophisticated, and had promised to treat Emma like her own daughter. Michael unlocked the front door quietly, hoping to surprise them both. The house was silent, except for the distant hum of the heating system. Everything was in its place, almost too perfectly arranged, as if the rooms were waiting for inspection rather than being lived in. He set down his luggage and called out softly but received no answer. Checking his watch, he realized it was nearly time for Emma to leave for kindergarten. He climbed the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, following the faint sounds coming from upstairs. Emma's bedroom door was slightly ajar. Michael pushed it open and found his 5-year-old daughter sitting on the edge of her bed, struggling with the laces of her small sneakers. Her blonde hair hung in loose, slightly tangled waves around her face, and her school uniform seemed a size too large, hanging loosely on her small frame. There were shadows under her eyes that he didn't remember seeing before he left. When she looked up and saw him standing in the doorway, her face transformed with pure joy. She ran to him with outstretched arms, and Michael caught her in a tight embrace, lifting her off the ground. But as he held her, something felt different. Emma seemed lighter than he remembered, more fragile somehow. He set her down gently and knelt to her level, studying her face with growing concern. Her cheeks looked hollower, her little collarbones more prominent beneath the oversized uniform shirt. Michael helped her finish tying her shoes, keeping his voice cheerful despite the unease settling in his chest. As he smoothed down her uniform, his eyes fell on the small pink lunchbox sitting on the bed. It was the same one Sarah had bought for Emma's first day of preschool, decorated with butterflies and flowers. Without thinking, he reached over and opened it, expecting to see the usual carefully prepared meal that he always insisted upon. What he found instead made his blood run cold. Inside the lunchbox was a piece of stale bread, hard around the edges, and some scraps that looked like they had been taken from someone else's plate. There was no fruit, no juice box, no sandwich with the crusts cut off the way Emma liked. Just these meager remnants that barely constituted a meal. Michael's hand trembled slightly as he held the lunchbox. He looked at his daughter, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why is this all you have for lunch today, sweetheart?" he asked, searching her blue eyes for answers. Emma looked at him with an expression that was far too understanding for a child her age. She spoke matter-of-factly, as if explaining something perfectly normal. "The new mommy says I can't eat too much, because kids don't need a lot of food. She says if I eat too much, there won't be enough for her. She told me that real food is for grown-ups, not for little girls like me." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He felt his throat tighten and his chest constrict as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He stared at the pitiful contents of the lunchbox, then back at Emma's innocent face, and felt something crack inside him. This was not the life he had promised Sarah he would give their daughter. This was not the home he thought he had built. Emma was still looking at him with those trusting eyes, waiting for him to say it was okay, that everything was fine. But Michael knew in that moment that nothing was fine at all. Michael forced himself to maintain composure as he prepared a proper breakfast for Emma making her scrambled eggs and toast with strawberry jam. He watched as she devoured the food with an urgency that broke his heart, as if she wasn't sure when her next meal would come. He packed a fresh lunch with a turkey sandwich, apple slices, crackers, and a juice box, all while his mind raced with dark possibilities he didn't want to consider. Emma seemed nervous about the new lunchbox contents, glancing toward the kitchen door, as if expecting someone to appear and take it all away. He drove her to Lakeview Elementary School himself that morning, something he realized he hadn't done in weeks. During the drive, he asked gentle questions about her days with Victoria, trying not to sound accusatory or worried. Emma's answers were careful, measured in a way that no 5-year-old should be. She mentioned being quiet in the house, staying in her room a lot and helping with cleaning even though she could barely reach the countess. Michael's grip tightened on the steering wheel with each revelation, but he kept his voice soft and encouraging, not wanting to frighten her into silence. After dropping Emma at school, Michael sat in his car in the parking lot for a long time, staring at nothing. Memories of Sarah flooded back. She had been the kind of mother who made every moment special, who believed that love was shown through actions, through packed lunches and bedtime stories and spontaneous dance parties in the kitchen. The contrast with what Emma had just described was so stark it felt like living in two different universes. He had trusted Victoria to honor Sarah's memory by caring for their daughter. Now he wondered what else he had been blind to while building his corporate empire. When Michael returned home, Victoria was in the master bedroom, fresh from her morning yoga class, wearing designer activewear and looking picture perfect. She seemed genuinely surprised and delighted to see him, rushing over to embrace him and pepper his face with kisses. She smelled expensive, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her shoulders. Everything about her was polished and curated, from her manicured nails to her practiced smile. Michael returned the embrace mechanically, studying her face for signs of the person Emma had described. But Victoria's mask was flawless. She asked about his trip with apparent interest, brought him coffee, and suggested they go out for dinner that evening to celebrate his return. Michael agreed, playing along while his mind worked through what to do next. He needed evidence, not just the word of a child that could be dismissed as imagination or misunderstanding. He needed to know the truth before he acted, because if he was wrong, he would damage his marriage irreparably. But if he was right, if Emma was truly being neglected or worse under his own roof, he would never forgive himself for the delay. That afternoon, while Victoria was out shopping with friends, Michael made a decision. He contacted a security company under the pretense of upgrading their home protection system. Within hours, technicians arrived and installed discrete cameras in the common areas, the kitchen and the hallways. He told Victoria that evening that he wanted better security given the value of their home and his frequent travel. She seemed pleased by his concern for their safety, commenting on what a good provider he was. The irony of her words wasn't lost on him. For the next few days, Michael maintained his normal routine, leaving for the office each morning and returning in the evenings. Victoria was the perfect wife in his presence, attentive to Emma, preparing elaborate dinners, maintaining their beautiful home. Emma seemed more relaxed when he was around, laughing more, eating better. It would have been easy to convince himself that he had overreacted, that the incident with the lunchbox was an isolated mistake. But something in Emma's eyes, a wariness that appeared whenever Victoria entered a room, kept Michael from dismissing his concerns. On the fourth night, after Victoria and Emma had gone to bed, Michael opened his laptop and accessed the camera feeds from earlier that day. He started with the morning footage after he had left for work. What he saw in those first few minutes made his stomach turn. The moment his car disappeared from the driveway, Victoria's entire demeanor changed. The warm smile vanished, replaced by a cold, irritated expression. She called Emma downstairs with a sharp tone that bore no resemblance to the gentle voice she used when Michael was present, and the story that unfolded before his eyes shattered any remaining hope that he had been mistaken about who his wife really was. Michael watched the screen with mounting horror as the recordings revealed a reality he had never imagined existed in his own home. Victoria moved through the house like a different person entirely, her face set in lines of perpetual annoyance. Emma appeared in the kitchen, already dressed in her school uniform, and Victoria immediately began criticizing her. The child's ponytail was crooked. Her socks didn't match properly. She had taken too long getting ready. The litany of complaints was delivered in a cold, cutting tone that made Emma's shoulders hunch forward defensively. The footage showed Victoria preparing her own elaborate breakfast, a spread of fresh fruit, yogurt, granola, and freshly squeezed orange juice. She ate leisurely at the kitchen island, while Emma stood nearby, silent and still, watching with hungry eyes. When Emma finally asked if she could have some breakfast too, Victoria sighed dramatically and pointed to the pantry, telling her to find something herself. The little girl retrieved a box of crackers and ate them standing up, not daring to sit at the table. Michael had to pause the video, his hands shaking too much to control the mouse. He took several deep breaths before forcing himself to continue watching. Throughout the day, the pattern repeated itself. Victoria spent hours on video calls with friends, laughing and gossiping, while Emma played quietly in her room or sat in the corner of the living room with her coloring books. When Emma accidentally knocked over a cup of water, Victoria's reaction was swift and harsh. She made the child clean it up immediately, berating her for being clumsy and careless, threatening to take away her toys if she couldn't be more careful. Emma's hands trembled as she wiped up the spill, her small face twisted with effort not to cry. Michael felt tears burning in his own eyes as he watched his daughter try so hard to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible in her own home. The lunch footage was perhaps the most damning. Victoria had friends over for an afternoon gathering, and the dining room table was laden with catered food, sandwiches, salads, pastries, and wine. The women laughed and ate, their voices carrying through the house. Emma appeared at the dining room door, drawn by the smell of food, and asked quietly if she could have something to eat. Victoria's expression hardened, and she told Emma to go to her room, that this food was for adults and that she had already eaten breakfast. The child hadn't eaten anything substantial since the crackers that morning, but she nodded obediently and retreated upstairs. Later, after the guests left, Victoria scraped the leftovers into a container and took a single plate upstairs to Emma's room, dropping it on the desk without a word before leaving. The portions were tiny, barely enough for a toddler, let alone a growing child. Michael fast-forwarded through hours of footage, his heart breaking with each new discovery. He saw Victoria ignore Emma's attempts at conversation, saw her send the child to bed without dinner, for minor infractions like leaving a toy on the floor, or speaking too loudly while Victoria was watching television. He watched as Emma tried desperately to please her stepmother, offering drawings she had made, attempting to help with household tasks, seeking any scrap of approval or affection. Victoria barely acknowledged these efforts, and when she did, it was usually to point out what Emma had done wrong or inadequately. The final piece of footage Michael watched that night nearly broke him. It was late evening after Emma's usual bedtime. The child had come downstairs for a glass of water and found Victoria in the kitchen, eating ice cream directly from the container. Emma stared at the ice cream with obvious longing, and Victoria caught her looking. Instead of offering her stepdaughter a bowl, Victoria held up the container and said something that the camera audio picked up clearly. "This is what happens when you work hard and act like a grown-up. Little girls who make messes and cause problems don't deserve treats. Maybe when you're older and more useful you'll understand." Emma's face crumpled, but she didn't cry. She just filled her water glass and went back upstairs, her small figure disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Michael closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his study, feeling as though he had failed at the most fundamental responsibility of fatherhood. He had provided Emma with every material comfort, the best schools, the finest clothes, a beautiful home. But he had left her alone with someone who saw her as nothing more than an inconvenience, a reminder of a previous marriage, a child who demanded attention that Victoria wanted entirely for herself. The recordings had revealed a truth that Michael could no longer deny or rationalize away. His daughter was suffering, and he was the only one who could stop it. Michael chose his moment carefully. He waited until Emma was at school, safely away from what he knew would be an explosive conversation. Victoria was in the living room, browsing through a fashion magazine with a cup of coffee, the picture of relaxed elegance. He sat down across from her, and something in his expression must have alerted her because her smile faltered slightly. He began calmly, asking her how she thought Emma had been adjusting to having him away on business trips. Victoria's response was smooth and practiced, assuring him that Emma was fine, that they had developed a nice routine together, that everything was under control. Then Michael changed tactics. He mentioned the lunchbox from his first morning back, the stale bread and scraps. He watched carefully as Victoria's face registered surprise, then calculation. She laughed lightly, a tinkling sound that now grated on his nerves, and explained that Emma must have been playing some kind of game. She assured him that she always prepared proper lunches, but that Emma sometimes traded food with other children or threw away what she didn't want. The explanation was delivered with such confidence that Michael could see how easily he might have believed it before seeing the recordings. But he pressed further, asking about Emma's eating habits in general, about whether Victoria felt the child was getting adequate nutrition. Victoria's demeanor began to shift. Her voice took on a slight edge as she suggested that perhaps Michael didn't appreciate how challenging it was to care for a child full-time, especially one who could be difficult and demanding. She mentioned that Emma had behavioral issues, that she often refused to eat what was prepared for her, that she was manipulative in ways Michael didn't see because she acted differently around him. The accusations came faster now, building into a portrait of a troubled, dishonest child who was trying to come between them. Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she spoke of how hard she had tried to be a good mother to Emma, how the child rejected all her efforts, how exhausting it was to pour love into someone who gave nothing back. Michael felt himself wavering for a moment. Victoria was a talented performer, and her tears seemed genuine. She reached for his hand, her voice breaking as she told him how much she loved him, how she had sacrificed her own freedom and her own life to become an instant mother to his daughter. She spoke of the judgmental looks from other mothers at school events, the whispers about being a stepmother, the constant comparisons to Sarah. She painted herself as a victim, trying her best in an impossible situation, with a child determined to undermine her. Michael could see how masterfully she was manipulating the narrative, twisting reality until he almost questioned his own perceptions. But then he thought of the videos, of Emma's small body hunched over crackers, while Victoria ate abundantly, of his daughter's careful, fearful movements through her own home. He pulled his hand away and told Victoria that he had seen everything. He didn't mention the cameras specifically, but he let her know that he was aware of how she treated Emma when he wasn't present. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Victoria's tears dried instantly, and her face hardened into something cold and calculating. She stood up, her voice no longer soft and wounded but sharp with anger. She accused him of spying on her, of trusting the word of a manipulative child over his own wife, of being so obsessed with his deceased first wife that he couldn't see reality clearly. The argument escalated quickly. Victoria's mask had completely slipped away, revealing the woman the cameras had captured. She paced the room, her voice rising as she defended her treatment of Emma. The child was spoiled, she insisted, used to being the center of attention, unwilling to accept that Michael had moved on with his life. Victoria claimed she had been trying to teach Emma responsibility and independence, to toughen her up for the real world, instead of coddling her the way Sarah had. She spoke Sarah's name with contempt, and Michael felt his anger surge in response. He told Victoria to pack her things, that he wanted her out of the house, that the marriage was over. But Victoria wasn't finished. She looked at him with something like triumph in her eyes and delivered her final blow. If he forced her to leave, she would fight him in court. She would claim that he was an absentee father who prioritized work over his child, that he had left Emma in her care and now was trying to blame her for his own failures. She would paint herself as the devoted stepmother who had sacrificed everything, only to be cast aside when it became convenient. She would make the process messy and public, dragging the sterling name through scandal. Michael realized with a sinking feeling that Victoria had been preparing for this possibility all along, building a defensive strategy in case her true nature was ever discovered. The following days were tense and silent. Victoria remained in the house, but they barely spoke, except when Emma was present. In front of their daughter, Victoria maintained her facade of normalcy, though Michael could now see through every forced smile and hollow gesture. He arranged his schedule to be home as much as possible, working from his study, making sure he was present for meals and bedtime routines. Emma seemed To sense the shift in the household dynamics, becoming quieter and more withdrawn, Michael tried to reassure her with extra attention and affection, but the damage Victoria had done was not something that could be healed quickly or easily. Then came the call from Lakeview Elementary that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Mrs. Patricia Henderson, Emma's kindergarten teacher, reached out to Michael directly. Her voice was careful but concerned as she explained that Emma had experienced a fainting spell during recess. The school nurse had examined her and found that the child appeared malnourished and exhausted. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that this wasn't an isolated incident. Over the past few months, she had noticed Emma arriving at school with empty lunch containers, falling asleep during class, and showing signs of stress that were unusual for a child her age. The teacher had hesitated to say anything earlier, not wanting to intrude on family matters, but the fainting episode had forced her to act. Michael thanked her and immediately left his office. His heart pounding with a mixture of fear and rage, he picked Emma up from school himself, holding her small hand tightly as they walked to the car. She seemed embarrassed by the attention, apologizing for causing trouble. The fact that she felt the need to apologize for nearly collapsing from weakness made Michael want to scream. Instead, he told her gently that she had done nothing wrong, that he was sorry for not paying closer attention, and that things were going to change. He took her out for an early dinner at her favorite restaurant, watching with a mix of joy and sadness as she ate an actual meal with appropriate portions. The pleasure she took in something so simple was heartbreaking. When they returned home, Victoria was waiting with a carefully constructed explanation. She claimed that Emma must have skipped breakfast that morning without her knowledge, that children sometimes did such things to get attention or make statements. Michael didn't bother arguing. He simply informed Victoria that he had consulted with attorneys and would be filing for separation. She could stay in the guest room temporarily while arrangements were made, but her involvement in Emma's daily care was over. He had already hired a professional nanny who would start the following week. Victoria's eyes flashed with fury, but she maintained her composure, retreating to the guest room without another word. That night, Michael discovered that Victoria had found the cameras. He came downstairs for a glass of water and found her in the living room holding one of the tiny devices in her hand. She looked at him with cold calculation and simply said that she understood the game now. She would be more careful. The implicit threat was clear. She knew she was being watched, so she would ensure that nothing she did could be used against her. She would play the role of the concerned stepmother perfectly whenever she thought she might be recorded, and she would make Emma's life difficult in ways that left no visible evidence. Michael realized he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he had initially understood. Victoria wasn't just neglectful or cold. She was strategic, intelligent, and willing to wage psychological warfare to maintain her position. The situation deteriorated further when Michael's neighbor, Robert Chen, approached him one Saturday morning while he was getting the mail. Robert was a retired teacher who lived in the house adjacent to theirs, and he seemed uncomfortable with what he needed to say. He mentioned that over the past several months he had noticed Emma outside alone quite often, sometimes crying in the backyard or sitting in the parked car in the driveway. He had recorded some of these instances on his phone, initially intending to mind his own business, but becoming increasingly troubled by what he witnessed. Robert confided that he had been considering contacting Child Protective Services, but wanted to speak with Michael first. Neighbor to neighbor, father to father. Michael felt his world crumbling around him. The realization that Emma's suffering had been visible to others, that people outside his home had noticed what he had failed to see, was almost unbearable. He thanked Robert for his concern and honesty, assuring him that steps were being taken to protect Emma. But as he walked back inside, Michael understood that time was running out. Victoria's presence in the house was becoming more dangerous with each passing day, and he needed to act decisively before the situation spiraled completely beyond his control. Something shifted in Emma during those difficult weeks. Michael noticed it first in small ways, how she held her head a little higher, how her eyes followed Victoria with a new kind of awareness rather than fear. His daughter was learning to recognize injustice, even if she didn't have the words to name it yet. She had always been artistic, spending hours with her crayons and colored pencils, creating worlds on paper that were brighter and kinder than the one she inhabited. But her drawings had recently taken on a darker quality, filled with shadows and empty spaces that spoke volumes about her inner landscape. One afternoon, Emma worked on a particular drawing with intense focus. Michael watched from the doorway of her room as she carefully selected her colors, her small tongue poking out slightly in concentration, the way Sarah's used to when she was working on something important. When Emma finished, she held up the picture and studied it for a long moment, before placing it carefully in her school folder. She didn't show it to Michael, and something about the deliberate secrecy of the gesture made him curious, but he didn't press her. He was learning that sometimes children needed to find their own ways to speak their truths. The next morning, Mrs. Henderson called Michael at work. Her voice was different this time, urgent and emotional. She explained that Emma had given her a drawing during art time, specifically asking the teacher to keep it safe. The image was haunting in its simplicity and clarity. It showed two figures, one large and shadowy without distinct features, holding a plate piled high with food. The other figure was small, clearly meant to be a child with blonde hair holding an empty plate. Above the scene, Emma had written in her careful kindergarten letters, "I am hungry." Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked as she described how Emma had looked at her after handing over the drawing, her blue eyes steady and knowing, as if she understood exactly what she was doing and why. It was a deliberate cry for help, a child taking control of her narrative in the only way she knew how. Michael felt something fundamental shift inside him. Emma had found her voice, and he would honor her courage with action. He left work immediately and drove to the school where Mrs. Henderson met him in her classroom. She showed him the drawing, and Michael had to take several steadying breaths before he could speak. This wasn't just evidence. It was his daughter's pain made visible, her suffering transformed into something that could no longer be ignored or rationalized. Mrs. Henderson also showed him the photographs that Robert Chen had shared with the school administration, a timeline of Emma's deterioration captured in images of a lonely child in an empty backyard, in a parked car, looking lost in her own home. The teacher explained that the school was obligated to report the situation, that they had already contacted the appropriate authorities, but she wanted Michael to know first, to give him the chance to be the one to protect his daughter. She spoke carefully about Victoria's interactions during school pickup and events, mentioning inconsistencies she had noticed, times when Emma seemed anxious before going home, moments when Victoria's public persona didn't quite match the reality reflected in Emma's behavior. Mrs. Henderson had been a teacher for 23 years, and she had learned to read the signs. She told Michael that Emma was a remarkable child who deserved better, and that whatever he needed to do to ensure her safety, the school would support him completely. Armed with Emma's drawing, Robert's photographs, and the school's formal concerns, Michael finally had everything he needed. He contacted his attorney that afternoon and initiated immediate legal proceedings. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. This wasn't just his word against Victoria's anymore. It was a child's plea for help supported by documentation from multiple independent sources. His lawyer assured him that with this level of proof, Victoria's threats of a messy court battle would fall flat. No judge would look favorably on someone who had neglected and psychologically harmed a 5-year-old child in their care. That evening, Michael sat down with Emma and told her how brave she was, how proud he was of her for speaking up in her own way. He promised her that she would never have to be afraid in her own home again, that he would make sure she was safe and loved and cared for the way she deserved. Emma didn't say much in response. She simply climbed into his lap and rested her head against his chest, and Michael felt her small body relax in a way it hadn't in months. For the first time since his early return from Tokyo, he felt like he was actually being the father Sarah had trusted him to be, the father Emma needed him to be. The hardest part wasn't over yet, but they had turned a corner, and there was finally light visible at the end of the long, dark tunnel they had been traveling through.